Hi, I'm Ashley Smith, and welcome to Nature in the Hills. Today we'll be speaking with one of my favorite birders, Mike Mencotti. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Thank you for asking me, Ashley.
Thanks
It's a
for
pleasure
coming.
to be here.
Great. So first of all, what is birding?
Different things to different people. To myself and some of my friends, it's an obsession. It's a
Right.
passion. But people get involved in it at all levels, whether they just notice birds as they're taking a walk, have a bird feeder in their yard. But it's important to know that you ask me about birding and not bird watching, because birding is more than just looking at the birds. You listen for the birds as well. Most of my friends and I, we do probably a half to 3/4 of our bird identification by our ears, because you learn the songs and sometimes you just get a fleeting glance,
Yeah.
but you can hear them. And it just adds another dimension.
Right, right. So what first interested you in birding, and kind of how did you get started?
Well, let's see. We got to go back about 30 years ago, believe it or not. I was dating this woman, and she was a birder. And I said, birding? And she said, sure. So she bought me for my birthday a pair of cheap binoculars and a field guide. And I was living in downtown Detroit at the time, so I went to Belle Isle, which is a beautiful park. I don't know if you've ever been there.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. And I was sitting there. It was a beautiful, I think it was October day, and I'm sitting in some clearing in a field, and then I'm saying, now what do I do? I had no idea. So I sat on a log, and I watched this bird land across the field and perch. And I said, oh. So I look it up, and I did find out what it was, and I still
Good for
remember
you.
that bird. It was an American kestrel, and it was a beautiful bird.
Nice.
And I
Yeah.
thought, this is pretty cool.
That's a good first bird to
Yeah,
have.
it is. The first bird I've noticed. And of course, like everybody else, you notice birds, but they're always sort of like in the back of your mind. You're not aware. And I thought, this is kind of a cool hobby. And it got me out. It got me walking, connecting with nature. And the rest has been pretty much solid birding. It's been my
It's an
hobby.
addiction now, huh?
Yeah.
You can
Yeah.
admit it.
Yeah, I know. I'll come clean. It's an addiction.
So many birders have what's called life lists, so birds that they've accumulated over the years that they've seen. So how many bird species have you encountered, and what are some of your favorites?
Well, to answer your question, I've encountered 704 different species in my life. But who's counting, right?
That's amazing.
Not all of them have been here at Heritage Park, of course.
Right.
But I don't do a lot of world traveling, but wherever I am, and that's one of the benefits of birding, is you're always aware of the birds. You never know when you're going to bump into a new one. I am a lister at heart. I keep lists because it's so easy to with computer programs.
Right.
And you can make a March list, an August list, and July list for Oakland County. You can make any list you want, and then it's kind of fun when you've seen just about all the birds you can in an area to sort of see what you can do to add to a particular list, like a Heritage Park list or a
Yeah.
Woodland Hills list or Kensington Metro Park list. So there's always some drive, if you will, to add your list. But in Oakland County, I've seen about 250 different species.
Wow.
And I'm not the top in the county.
That's
I'm number
amazing.
2, but I'm not the top.
So that being said, too, so you have your list kind of out to the public or online, perhaps,
Yes.
that other folks can see birds that you've seen in
Yep.
different areas of the state. Do you go on and look at other people's
Of
lists
course.
to see where they found
Of
different
course,
birds? Yeah.
yes. I mean, we're very competitive, but in a very friendly way.
Right,
Right. There's a program called eBird. It's put out by Cornell University, and it's free and open, to anybody.
Yeah, they have a great site.
Oh, they do.
Yeah.
And it's citizen science. It's wonderful because what happens is as people put their sightings in, they accumulate data. And that data help them when they're doing their research on a specific species. Now they have many birders put their data in, and they can study any species in any area, and they can start to see trends.
Yeah.
They can start to see nesting habits. They can start to see population crashes and all those things that ornithologists, that's the scientists who study birds,
Right.
can find and find it very useful. It's something that everybody takes part, well, most people take part in, and it's grown exponentially. I think recently I read that there were more than 10 million checklists around the world have been put on this website, and everybody can kind of see if you're going to wherever, the Bahamas or whatever, for a vacation, for example, you can look to see what birds you're likely to see and when specifically on a Google map exactly where it's been seen. So it really takes the guesswork out of finding birds and finding good places to go birding.
Yeah, so the internet's made it a lot easier to accumulate all that
absolutely.
data. That's great.
Absolutely.
So what advice do you have for beginning birders, folks that are just starting out with birding like you were years ago when you saw your American kestrel?
Well, you need, of course, a place to go, which is your window or your driveway.
Pretty simple.
Yeah, I stand out on my driveway a lot, usually on Sunday mornings, because my neighbors think I'm a little unusual when I'm standing looking at the sky in binoculars. In fact, I had one neighbor after about 4 years said, "Are you looking for UFOs?" I had to tell him, "No, I'm looking for birds." And he said, "Oh." He still wasn't too comfortable with
Didn't
that.
quite understand.
But whatever. But anyways, to get back to your question, you just get yourself a pair of binoculars that helps immensely, and a field guide. Field guide will help you sort through the different species and help you identify them, which is part of it.
Right.
You know, and I like to tell people to study the common birds, the house sparrows, the robins, the starlings, the cardinals. I mean, not just because they're wonderful to look at, but when you find, it'll draw your attention to when you find something unusual and different, and that usually is part of the attraction of it. In fact, when I tell people birding's my hobby, they all say, "Oh, like that's pretty strange." And then everyone, to a person, has a bird story they want to share with me. So people are already birding. They're already aware.
Whether they know it or not.
Yeah, and you can bird anywhere you want.
Great. So I guess what are some things to get started with birding? What are some things that folks need? I know you mentioned binoculars and field guides.
You do need a pair of binoculars, and then you need to sort of like set them up, right? Which is pretty easy to do. You get instructions to do that.
Right.
And then a field guide. This one is wonderful. The pictures are great, and you don't have to sort through 500 species you'll never ever see in Michigan to find the one you're looking at. I guess the downside of this is once you get out of Michigan, this might be a little, you
need something
off the
a little
mark.
more.
But you know what's happening now with smartphones is you can get apps, smartphone apps that have the field guides that you can purchase for a reasonable price, probably less than this, the actual printed version. And it's downloaded onto your smartphone, and since most of us have smartphones with us a lot, you've always got your field guide with you.
Right.
And it adds the attraction of the sounds, the bird calls and the bird sounds. So you hear
Sometimes those
something-
are the hardest things to identify is when you hear the different sounds.
Absolutely, and if you think, I wonder if that's a house finch, I wonder if that's a house sparrow, you can play the song and it can really lock in the identification. So it adds a whole different dimension to appreciating birds, and technology working for us, I think.
Right.
In a good
So
way.
we mentioned too the internet and using your smartphones when you go birding. So is there any other ways that technology has helped with birding, or how birders use different types of technologies?
Well, for bird locating,
Oh, yeah.
obviously that is, for the eBird. But you know what's happening now is birding these days is going past just binoculars. Probably the biggest group of new birders are photographers, because digital photography is making everybody enjoy it, and it's bringing it inexpensively, and you take really high quality photos, and people are very interested in taking pictures of pretty things like the nature around them, of course. Well, with birds, people start taking pictures of birds, and now you can post the pictures and say, "I don't know what bird this is, can somebody help me?" And of course there are little chat rooms, if you will, that birders subscribe to, and then they help each other out. So the technology has not only brought a new type of birder, which is the birder photographer, but it's also sort of increased the sphere of communication to the point where it's one huge happy family.
Yeah, really big network of
It
folks
is,
that
it is,
are
yeah.
helping each other. And obviously, when you take a picture, you're going to want to know what you took a picture of.
Sure,
So those are just creating new birders all the time, which is pretty neat.
And if you see a very rare bird, it's sort of now it's a given that you should have photo documentation before before people will say, "Yeah, that's what you really saw."
Right.
So
It helps.
it does. It helps keep everybody sort of, shall we say, sort of honest about it.
Right.
And also helps people learn. It helps everybody learn.
Right.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that folks can bird in their driveway or out their window. So where else can folks go birding, or where should they go?
Well, parks. I mean, Heritage Park's a wonderful place to bird. I know I've been coming here since I moved into Farmington Hills about 12 years ago, 13 years ago, and I can't say I'm here every week, but I'm a regular.
Yeah.
And I'm usually here and gone before the Nature Center opens.
Right.
'Cause
We
I'm,
don't see you as
early
often.
bird catches the worm. I'm here at
Right.
8 o'clock pounding on the gate to
That's
get
the
in.
trick to birding, for
Yeah,
sure.
it is. Birds are much more active in the morning than they are in the middle of the afternoon because they're trying to eat. They just slept and they want, they need to refuel. So they're more active. They're singing more. They're flying more. They're just more active. They're more likely to see them. Heritage Park is a wonderful place. The metro parks are great as well. Any place that, even along rivers tend to be a great place to go birding because birds use rivers for navigation,
Right.
when they're migrating.
Right.
And then pretty soon, you find your favorite spot and you connect with nature. And next thing you know, 3 hours have gone and you say, wow, that was so cool. I didn't think about my job. I didn't think about my problems. And
Yeah.
that's one of the big
Kind
attractions.
of a type of meditation almost.
It's sort of, yeah.
Yeah. So what are some common misconceptions that folks might have about birding?
Oh, I'm glad you asked me that. A lot of people think that small blackbirds are baby crows.
Oh.
And because just like people, they start out small and then they grow. Well, when passerines, which are a fancy name for perching birds, the ones that perch on trees and wires and things, they don't come out of their nest until they're full grown. So if you see what looks like a small crow, it's not a crow, for example. It's probably a grackle or a red-winged blackbird or something. So a lot of people think that little birds are just younger versions of the bigger birds. Ducks are an exception to that. Little ducklings, of course, are out of their nest, and they are kind of waddling around at an early age. And those are little ducks that are going to grow bigger. But for the most part, the birds that you see are about the size that they're going to be.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Are there seasons over, like better seasons for birding over others? So winter versus fall, or that kind of thing.
It sort of depends on your focus. If you're trying to see as many different species, then the migration times are spring and fall, because the birds are heading north for the breeding grounds in the spring and heading south in the fall.
Right.
And there's only a small window where some of these species actually pass through. So May is like the birders' Mecca month. That's where birders don't do anything but go birding in May, right? And the fall migration tends to be a little more protracted. It's usually, depending on the species, like mid-August to probably the end of October.
Okay.
So that's to see the more unusual birds or the birds that are uncommon.
Right.
Of course, summertime is wonderful in Michigan, right? So you don't need much of an excuse to get out. I think a great time to go birding and being aware of the birds that nest here would be June and July. Wintertime is a little tougher. That's for the hardcore, because people like to cocoon a little bit in winter. But I'm out there all the time anyway.
Braving the elements.
And it's fun, yeah. And you see different birds. Birds that find Michigan warm in winter come down and spend the winter. It's sort of like us going to Florida, right? They come down to Michigan. You can imagine what the weather's like where they nest.
Right.
But then there's the new birds that you'll find then. So there's always something that's worth going out and looking for.
Right. And winter's actually an interesting time to go birding because you don't have as much of the foliage on the trees, so sometimes it's easier to spot the birds that are here. So for me, I enjoy it in the winter time because it's easier to spot those birds that sometimes might be hiding.
Oh, absolutely.
Even though it's a lot colder, but sometimes it's worth it. Yeah.
Yes, yes. and of course, they stand out against the snow, too, which is like there's something wonderful about seeing that red cardinal against that white snow. It just,
it's a
it
great,
really makes your jaw drop. I'll never get tired of seeing that.
It's a pretty typical winter site, definitely around Heritage Park for sure. And so you mentioned before that you're at Heritage Park on a regular basis birding. So it seems that Heritage Park is maybe one of your favorite spots.
Oh, I love it.
Why is that?
Well, first of all, it's close to my house.
Right.
It's about a 5-10 minute drive, which is wonderful. The trails go through different kinds of habitat. The meadow, you can see a lot of birds that you only see in the meadow type habitat here. You can see the woodland birds as you go up the river trail. And it's along the river, which means it's a good migration path because birds use rivers to migrate. They use them as sort of like their GPS. And lake shores and rivers are always a good place to go to see migrants. And it has, of course, the bird feeders, which you never know what's going to turn up there.
Yeah, always a surprise.
Yes, the pond. the pond is a wonderful place where you wouldn't believe how many different kinds of herons actually stop and see. It doesn't get rafts of waterfowl, but it does get birds that like a little bit of water, the water's edge. So you never know what you're going to find here at Heritage Park.
Right.
And it's just a wonderful park.
Right.
Yeah.
Awesome. So you lead a New Year's Day bird count here at Heritage Park almost every year. How many years have you been doing that?
I looked that up, and I've been doing it 9 years.
Wow.
I didn't, I decided, and it's all very vanity. It's because I wanted to get my list going for that year. So I said, well, let's go to Heritage Park, and I'm just going to count all the birds. And I talked to Joe Derrick, who used to work here for many years, and I said, would you be okay if I just counted the birds and gave what you post? And he said, oh, that'd be great, thank you. So I've been doing that for 9 years, and we've seen some pretty good birds, pretty unusual birds over the years.
Yeah, a lot of folks look forward to us posting that list every year. They like to see some of the different birds that are out, especially this time of year in winter. What are some of the more interesting birds that you've come across during your New Year's Day bird counts that you've done?
Well, getting back to the misconceptions about birds, here's one that definitely ties into the New Year's counts, that robins. Everybody thinks robins fly south for the winter.
Right.
Well, we get more than 100 on every New Year's count.
Yeah, you always get a lot on the list.
Because their food source, of course, not worms, the grounds are frozen, but they do adapt and eat berries, and there's a lot of berry bushes here and berry trees, and as long as the food's here, the robins will stay, because migration is very treacherous. Birds don't like to do that.
Right.
It's very treacherous to them.
Yeah.
So if they don't have to migrate, they won't.
Right. A lot of folks think birds migrate because of the colder temperatures, and it's more about their lack of food.
Yep.
A lot of those insect-eating birds can't find food in the winter, so if they have food, they'll stick around.
Yeah.
Sometimes bluebirds will be here even into November and December if they can find food. So.
Well, we usually see bluebirds on the New Year's counts too. Some years do, some years you don't. And again, it's a matter of food. I think they tend to, of course they nest here, but I think they tend to fly around looking for food, and sometimes they're here on the New Year's count, and sometimes they're here 3 days afterward.
Right. You never know.
They kind of wander around. Absolutely. Another wonderful bird that we saw on a New Year's count was a long-eared owl, which is a very secretive owl that will be in Michigan in the winter, lower Michigan in the winter, and it's kind of a prize for the birders to see because they're so rare to see. And then they're kind of cool because they elongate as they get spooked. So
they make themselves look taller.
Yeah, it's taller and tougher, right? You know, I mean, to a predator, that might make a difference, potential predator. The owls tend to camouflage themselves against the trunk of the tree, and it's you could be looking at them, you don't even know you're looking at them.
Right.
You know, so to find one is wonderful.
Yeah. I know that I've told a couple folks about the long-eared owl that you found during your bird counts, and we've gone looking for its nest and things like that. So it's a pretty elusive bird for sure.
Oh, it is. Yeah.
So in the past, you volunteered at the Nature Center for something called our Advanced Junior Naturalist Club that we have in the summertime. And so we had about 25 7 to 11-year-olds that you kind of taught the basics of birding, or kind of introduced them to what birding is and how they can get started. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience you had with that?
Oh, I had a lot more fun than they did. That's true. You know, I teach middle school, so I'm very familiar with the 11-year-old age group. However, and I geared sort of my little presentation workshop to an 11-year-old. And I got there, and there were a lot more 7-year-olds than 11-year-olds, and I'm thinking, oh, no, this is not going to work. I guess it did work. They stayed focused, bless their hearts. I probably bored them to tears in some of it, but still, they did all had a bird story for me, and they were all showing off, and I thought, how cool is that? That 7-year-olds are already kind of plugged in to nature to the point where they're comfortable talking about it, and they all have a story to tell, and they all want to, you know, just share them, and to see a whole group of them together like that was wonderful. When we got to an activity where we tried to find the bird in the field guide, I wish my students were that motivated all the time. They were just having a blast.
That's great.
And then, of course, they were given little binoculars and a field guide, and they had fun just going out and looking at the binoculars and looking at each other through the binoculars.
Yeah.
It's kind of fun.
Yeah, I mean, one of the neat things about that class, the advanced junior naturalist class that we offer here at the Nature Center, is that they do get their own little naturalist pack that they get to use throughout the duration of the summer and then get to take home with them after the class is completed.
Oh, that's
so
wonderful.
they get to keep the field guide and the binoculars, and so it was kind of neat since you know, your birding class was earlier on in the season. The rest of the summer, they always had their binoculars out.
Yep.
They were looking at birds in the field guide, so it was really interesting to see how they picked up on the information that you shared with them and how they kind of retained that knowledge and kept up with their birding. So they
And
really
of course, if
enjoyed
you
that.
turn the binoculars upside down and you hold it close, it becomes like a little microscope.
Yeah, that's true too. I think
Yeah.
they were having fun investigating on how to use the different tools and
Yep.
how they could manipulate them to use them in different ways. So
Well, it's a
really neat.
wonderful program because it gets people who are slightly or maybe a lot interested, even more interested in it.
Right.
And I think everybody needs a connection with nature. You know,
Absolutely.
we all have our computers and games and things. And believe me, that age group is really locked into the visual, you know, the fancy computer games and things. I think everybody needs to get out in nature a little bit, you know.
Yeah, it's great that they had that connection.
Yep.
So that being said, too, you're also a teacher at Detroit Country Day School.
Yes.
And you know, what are some ways, I guess, that you incorporate your passion for birding into your classroom and maybe inspire your students in that way?
Well, I'm an English teacher, believe it or
Yes.
not, and a writing teacher, so I don't directly do it in my curriculum. However, the 6th and 7th grade science class all has a bird watching program, a bird feeder program.
Oh, okay.
And they enter their sightings onto eBird, and they all keep their data, and they learn about, you know, spreadsheets, and they learn part of the science. They use the bird watching and the bird data as learning about keeping data as a scientist, as a young scientist. And I also have a club called Nature Discovery
Oh,
that I
great.
run, and it's quite popular. Sometimes it gets too popular, and you have too many students out there. It's kind of hard. You gotta it's like herding cats.
Right.
You know? But many of the students who are in that club, just like the advanced junior naturalists, they come with a love for it. They come with an interest in it, and they all want to tell me their stories. And the campus is along the Rouge River, like there's at Heritage Park, and of course that means that we get a lot of different birds, and they love it as much as I do when we see something unusual. So.
Right. Well, that's great that you can bring that to the school. I'm sure it's an invaluable experience for them, for sure.
Yeah, some come back later and say, you know, I'm a birder now, thanks to you.
Thanks to you.
Pat myself on the
Right.
back.
So we also have here at the Nature Center a Nest Watch program of our own, like you mentioned that you have at the school. We do a bluebird nesting program with Cornell University's nestwatch.org. And we have about 40 bluebird nesting boxes here in Heritage Park, and about 30 volunteers every year that come out and monitor those boxes
That's
every
wonderful.
week. Yeah, and they input their data into the Cornell University's website and kind of with around the country collecting all that data. So why do you think those nesting or the feeder watch monitor programs are important?
Oh, it's not just important, it's crucial to the survival of that species because bluebirds are wimps,
Yeah.
plain and simple, and they're cavity dwellers. And of course, people have dead trees, they tend to think it's an eyesore and they cut them down. Well, that causes a housing shortage for any of the cavity nesters, okay?
Right.
So first of all, there's not a lot of suitable nesting places for them, and they're kind of like wimps compared to the house sparrows and the starlings. So they're really kind of fighting for their territory, and the bluebird houses gives them literally a fighting chance for survival. It has brought back that species to respectable numbers,
Right.
and it's very important. And it's kind of fun to, again, to get the young people involved in that, and they can kind of see how people can make a difference. And it's not that much work, and it's not an eyesore. It's just kind of fun to do. Now, I'm not sure if you set one up in everybody's backyard, but bluebirds would nest in there. You have to have the right area. Like the meadow here is a wonderful spot. And plus tree swallows then will come into another bird that needs those kinds of cavity.
Need some help,
Yeah.
right.
And it's the size of the hole that dictates.
Makes a big difference.
Yeah, it dictates what kind of birds will be able to fit inside and use it. So you can kind of, by making the hole bigger or smaller, you can eliminate or attract certain species to take advantage of those cavities.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, you mentioned it's another way for young people to get connected with nature, and really people of all ages. And that's something to be said too about our volunteers, is that we have volunteers that range in age from 7 years old to 80 plus years old. So it's something that all ages can, you know, take part in.
Yep.
The other thing too to mention about our bluebird monitors is they get training in March every year to go out and do that. So they get special training, and they kind of get special permission to go off trail in Heritage Park, which is normally not something that visitors are, you know, supposed to do. So they get that special permission to go off trail and monitor the boxes. And I think it's a great way to get a more up close feeling with Heritage Park and the different species and birds that you can find here for sure. Have you witnessed bluebirds in Heritage Park yourself?
Oh yes, I see them all, well, I don't say all the time, but definitely during the breeding season and during migration. They have a kind of an unusual call that you hear, oh, there's the bluebirds, and then they go flying by.
Right, kind of that
They're like
flash
little,
of blue.
Yeah, they're like little robins. They're in the same family as the robins, the thrush. So, but they tend to sit more on the wires and then fly down and pick up food and go back up to the wires. They're not worm eaters like the robins are. But yes, I've seen them many times in the park, and it's such a delight. I mean, they're so gorgeous.
Right.
They're just so gorgeous.
Right.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people see the bluebird nesting monitor, you know, nesting areas and think that they're automatically going to see bluebirds there. And how you mentioned before, there are some other desirable birds that use the boxes, like tree swallows and even chickadees and house wrens sometimes. But then there are also those competitor species like the house sparrow that you also mentioned. And it's an important, one of the reasons why we have the bluebird boxes is to help them compete with those house sparrows that are not native species to Michigan.
And the starlings as well.
Right, the starlings too, and cowbirds also are another challenge for them, coming in and kind of sneaking their eggs into their nests. One of the other things too about the Heritage Park is that we have those meadow habitats that bluebirds need to thrive. I mean, they were thriving here before when we had vast expanses of farmland, and they had a lot of habitat. But now, obviously, with urban sprawl, their habitat's getting smaller and smaller. So it's another reason why the monitoring program is really important.
Absolutely, and you know, habitats don't just get eliminated overnight. It's little by little by little, and then you know, these birds and other mammals get pushed into smaller areas. They're competing with themselves, with each other.
Right.
Other individuals. So not only do they have the aggressive house sparrows and starlings, but now, you know, with the housing shortage, they're trying to compete with each other. So
Absolutely. Yeah, and other desirable birds too. So what are some helpful websites that folks can go to get more information about birding, and maybe some information that they can get about going out and birding themselves?
Sure, there are a few of them. ebird.org,
Okay.
and that's the one, the Cornell site that I was talking about earlier. That's where you can find all sorts of information about, you know, where to go birding anywhere in the world, just about. Well, there's also oaklandaudubon.org, which is Oakland County Audubon Society, and they have a wonderful webpage and a lot of information on all sorts of things, conservation and birding, and there's a field trip link. And if you click on that, most weekends, maybe about twice or three times a month, there are field trips that are set up for all levels of birding. All beginners are welcome.
That's great.
And some of them are local, some of them are kind of far afield, you know, Point Pelee, for instance, a little near Toledo, but they're wonderful places to learn where to go birding to see the most unusual and the most birds you see. And they're run year round, these field trips. I used to lead them for Macomb and Detroit Audubon Society for many years, and we go everywhere, anytime, so it's a lot of fun. The Macomb Audubon Society and Detroit Audubon Society web links, and they're both .orgs. There's another great place to find birding. There's a national organization that's just for birders, and it's called the American Birding Association, or ABA.org, and that's a place to find a lot of information. But I have to tell you, that's not as much for beginners as it is for the more hardcore group. But you know, you never know. You click, you might find some good information from there too as well.
And I know too that I've also went on to Bird Jams, which has a lot of the calls on there, which I think they also have an app that we were talking about before for your phone, that you can have all the calls on there that you can take out in the field with you, which is really handy. And I know that the nestwatch.org also has a lot of information about birds and kind of their nesting habitats and stuff like that.
Well, you know, birds and technology go hand in hand because birds were tweeting centuries before we had cell
That's very
phones, and I
true.
think that's important for everybody to know.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on Nature in the Hills and telling us all about your birding experience and giving tips to new birders, because like you said, it is a really fantastic experience and it's a way for folks to connect with nature, especially here in Heritage Park. So thanks again for coming on.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was a blast.
Great. If you'd like to learn more information about birding in Heritage Park, stop by the Nature Center and ask one of our naturalist staff. Thanks for watching Nature in the Hills.